together in New England. Some have referred to the split between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick as a divorce. Brady's father was a recent guest on Del and Sonia Curry's podcast, and Tom Sr. was not ready to go that far. He said, quote, "I think it's just change. I don't know that it's a divorce. 20 years together is a long time. I can't tell you the hundreds of times Tommy has said Bill is the best coach in football. Tommy sings Bill's praises. Divorce sounds a little bit harsh." It is probably the most asked question in the NFL over the last 2 decades. Is it Brady or is it Bill? Who is most responsible for the unprecedented run of success the Patriots have enjoyed over 20 years? Maybe this year we will finally find out. Meanwhile, it seems worth reminding you that while there is no way to evaluate Brady without Bill, because it has never happened, there is plenty of data to evaluate Bill without Brady. And for whatever it's worth, it's not a pretty picture. Bill Belichick coached exactly 100 games before Tom Brady's first start. He was 42-58. Most of that was in Cleveland, where he took over a Browns team that had made the playoffs 5 out of 6 years. He coached them 5 seasons. He had losing records in 4. By the way, Nick Saban was his defensive coordinator 4 of those 5 seasons. And yes, the ending was a terrible situation. The team planning to relocate to Baltimore. Factor that in however you like. Then he went to New England. Belichick was 5-13 with Drew Bledsoe, #1 overall draft pick, at quarterback. Then Brady took over. In his first start, he beat Peyton Manning and the Colts by 31 points as a double-digit underdog. He then went 13-3 the rest of the way and won the Super Bowl. Brady went on to average 28 points a game as a starter over his Patriots career. That is the most by any quarterback ever. In games started by anyone else, Belichick's teams have averaged 19 points. Brady also won 6 playoff games in which his team allowed 28 or more points. No other quarterback has ever won more than 2. And Brady made himself a salary cap bargain. In none of his championship seasons was Brady a top 10 cap hit in the league. So what does all of this mean? Certainly doesn't necessarily take anything away from Belichick as a coach. I believe he is the greatest in the history of American team sports. But the facts are the facts. So if he is ever going to accomplish anything without Tom Brady, he's going to have to start doing it now. That's what I say and what the numbers say. Let's see what my guys say. Marcus, Swagoo, Spears, I give you the first crack at this. What do you think?
First of all, the damn down barrels are the greatest thing on this show, man. That's number one. The second thing is this, man. Greeny, you can't point out a great coach or a coach that we think is the GOAT per se without one of the players being the GOAT. Look at all of the relationships over the history of sports. Phil Jackson, Michael Jordan, Phil Jackson, Kobe Bryant. We look in college. We look at John Wooden with Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, known as. We look at all of these greats, Steve Walsh, Joe Montana. It is a correlation. You have to have the guys that can execute whatever plan you're giving them and even sometimes overcome when the plan is not all that great. Like to your point, it does not take away from Bill Belichick being arguably the greatest coach of all time. But find me a marriage in the history of team sports where we've mentioned the coach being the greatest of all time without a player on that team being the greatest of all time or top 1 or 2 in whatever job they're doing, and you can prove me wrong. But until I don't see it, I've never seen it, not to take anything away from any coach that's ever done great things.
Go ahead,
Dan. Tom Brady is one of those guys where you will be mentioned as greatest of all time.
Yeah, Marcus, you're wrong. Greeny, during the commercial break, you had said this down barrel is fire. And out of respect, I was like, man, Greeny, you've had some good down barrels, and that was the best one ever. I mean, 2 things stood out to me. I did not know that the 5 years previous to Bill Belichick becoming the head coach of the Browns, they went to the playoffs 4 out of 5 seasons.
That was
surprising to me.
5 out of 6 seasons.
5 out of 6, I'm sorry. And then the second thing was the fact that Brady has averaged more points as a starting quarterback than anyone else, and he had 6 wins when his defense gave up 28 points in the playoffs or more. Like, those are some startling numbers to me that really encapsulate an argument. And really, I mean, I'm trying to be dead serious here. Like, I kind of leaned towards Brady for a while now, but hearing the reality of these numbers, and you can't run from some of these things, it only pounds home, pounds the point to me that this is a Brady-driven thing, and that was the best down barrel that you've ever done.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to make a lot of people
Marcus,
really angry in New England. Marcus, you're wrong.
Go ahead, Marcus.
How do you get them dead wrong? I just sat here and gave you a soliloquy about if you're going to be mentioned as the greatest coach of all time. 9 times out of 10, you had the best player either of that era or of all time.
Here's the thing, though. In no other sport, and maybe this is because we correctly believe that the coach is more important in football than it is in any other sport. But in no other sport do we say, was it Michael or was it Phil? Was it Kobe or was it Phil? Was it Duncan or was it Pop? Was it Auerbach or was it Bill Russell? We always say, of course it was the player. The coach, there's no doubt, Phil Jackson was a major contributor to the Bulls winning all those championships. But Michael Jordan was the reason that they won them. Only in football do we wonder this aloud. And I just thought it was worth spelling out all of the ways in which Brady changed everything.
It's always the player. I'm with Dan. It's always my point in saying, if you are mentioned as the greatest coach of all time, by and large, you have the greatest player of all time, or one of the most generational game-changing players in the history of the game. There's someone, I'm gonna leave it alone after this. Somebody has to execute. Somebody has to go out there on their field to play and execute at a high level if you're going to be mentioned as the greatest coach of all time.
We will bring this back.
Marcus, the point of the down barrel. The point of the down barrel is to prove that since there was that execution, maybe that coach is viewed differently than he would have been without it. Like, that's the point of the down barrel, dude, is to realize the player executed
but
at
I have
such
to
a
leave it here.
remarkable
We
level.
will come back to this. I don't understand exactly how it is we are all agreeing, and yet we're arguing with each other. We'll come back and we'll discuss this a little further. A little later, we'll bring it up with Stephen A. as well. And I can tell you that we're bringing back some of the greatest Monday Night Football games ever tonight. We'll start with this 2018 record breaker, Mahomes and the Chiefs, Goff and the Rams. It was a classic. There were quite a few points scored, if you remember that game. And you'll see it tonight, 8 Eastern on ESPN and on the ESPN app. Meanwhile, in baseball, even with the recent deal between Major League Baseball and the Players Association, the big questions remain of when and how the league is going to start its season. The president of the Players Association is Tony Clark. He recently said the players would be open to playing in neutral sites if that's what it took to get back on the field. Here's what he said, quote, "Players want to play. That's what we do. Being able to get back on the field and being able to play, even if that means their fans are watching at home. We would play as long as we possibly could. Obviously, the weather becomes a challenge the later you get in the calendar year, but we would do our best to play as many as possible, regardless of when we start. The opportunity to play in neutral sites is something both sides are willing to discuss." So that is a lot on the table for our Mark Teixeira. Tex, great to see you, as always. What do you think of that? Let's start with neutral sites, playing the postseason, the World Series, and all of that in domes or in warm weather cities. What would you think of that?
Well, Tony Clark, the mouthpiece for the players, said it best. They'll play anywhere. Players will play in Timbuktu if you make a game there, because it's all about getting as many games as possible for these players. These guys are used to playing in spring training and, other places. It won't be a big deal for them to play neutral games. But the fact of the matter is the execution of these neutral sites will be very interesting. When does it start? Does it start, early, mid-November? Where exactly are the neutral sites? And I guarantee you there's going to be fights between different stadium owners and team owners about how do you split this revenue. So the questions are going to be, how do you execute the neutral sites late in the season?
The other piece of this that gets interesting is the idea of a lot of doubleheaders during the season, and it was even floated the notion that maybe you would play 7-inning doubleheaders. I know when we spoke last week, you were vehemently opposed to these concepts. Is your mind starting to change?
My mind is changing because I've talked to a few executives in Major League Baseball, and they said, sorry, Tex, this is going to happen. We have to squeeze the games in here. And for me, it's all about, the competition, putting players at risk. Guys are going to be playing way too many games in shortened amount of time. But the players have already said, listen, we are up to anything. We will play the extra games. We will play doubleheaders. And so what I would say is the only way that you can execute that is making sure that the players are protected. Play 7-inning games if you're going to do doubleheaders. And also, don't play extra innings. After the 10th inning, the game is over, because the worst thing you can have is have a doubleheader with one of those games going 11, 12 innings, and then the next day you play another 9. So we have to be very careful how much stress we're putting on these players. I think 7-inning games and limiting extra innings will help that.
Limiting extra innings is something that I actually campaigned for on my old show on Mike and Mike. I said back at that time that after 12 innings, the game should just be over. These 19-inning games they create a whole lot more problems than they are exciting for anybody. What is your thought? You're suggesting 10 innings here in a 7-inning game. What do you think? And is that something you think they should take with them whenever it is we come out of this and go back to some normalcy?
Yeah, it's a good idea, Greeny. I'm not, I'm a traditionalist by nature, and that's why the 7-inning game just kind of blew my mind. But as you think about what you actually have to do to protect these players and get these games moving, extra inning games get really boring. They can get really long. They can mess up a pitching staff for weeks. And so forget about just the double headers. I think the regular season, you should have games end after 10 innings. And Major League Baseball can really think about this in the next season and beyond, because this is